Good morning, children. Today in Social Science and History, in Class 9, we will continue the lesson Nazism and the Rise of Hitler. So we'll get to see the background of what were the reasons responsible for the rise of Hitler. So, first of all, we have already talked about the First World War. The First World War that was fought between 1914 to 1918. And Germany fought against the Allies, the countries which included England, France, and Russia. And then in 1917, the US joined. So together they defeated the Germans. So after that, after the defeat of the Germans, there was this peace treaty of Versailles. That is an agreement, and the terms and conditions were laid down, and the Germans considered this to be very harsh and humiliating. But there was no option left for them but to agree to this. So the peace treaty of Versailles was harsh and humiliating for the Germans, but it was forced to accept, which was there with the Allies. That is the countries of England, France, and Russia, and the US. Now, Germany, the Germany losses were heavy. One, they were blamed for the war, so they had to pay all the compensation for the war. Then they also lost many areas and territories to these allies. So we'll see what are the German losses that took place. It lost its overseas colonies, 1/10 of its population, and 13% of its territories. So that was a great impact on the Germans, but according to this treaty, that is what they had to agree to. So this is that overseas colonies were lost, the population, 1/10 of the population, and 13% of its territories were lost. They had to give up. Then the next loss that they suffered was of iron and coal. 75% of its iron and 26% of its coal to France, Poland, Denmark, and Lithuania. The Allied powers demilitarized Germany to weaken its powers. Now, what they did was that they did not want Germany to have a strong military power and strength. So, for that reason, they demilitarized. That means that Germany had to reduce its military power and strength so that they would not again be in a situation to attack anybody else. So that was there. Then another loss that they suffered was heavy loss. That was, one can say, that they had to pay £6 billion. Why they had to pay this? That the war guilt clause, they blamed Germany for the war and the damages. So because Germany was held responsible for the war, and a war is destructive, heavy losses are suffered everywhere, human life and otherwise also. So Germany was blamed for the war, and because it was responsible for the war, so they had to pay heavy damages, and the damages were so heavy that they had to pay £6 billion. So that is also a part of the Treaty of Versailles. Then the Allied armies also occupied Rhineland, which was rich in resources. So that was another loss that they suffered. So we see that heavy losses in the form of overseas colonies, their territories, the areas where there was iron and coal to the Allies, and they had to reduce their military power and strength, or in other words, it was demilitarized, and the compensation that they had to pay for the war and the damages that had resulted. So all these were heavy losses that they suffered. These were the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, many Germans held the new Weimar Republic responsible for the defeat in the war and the disgrace at Versailles. That is, many Germans had the feeling that because the Weimar Republic was responsible for the defeat in the war, in the First World War, and the humiliating and harsh conditions of the Treaty of Versailles was something that the people did not really appreciate. The people were very angry with these people for this signing of this Treaty of Versailles. So we see what are the effects of the war. A war, we are all aware that war is absolutely destructive. This absolutely devastating. So we see that the First World War that was fought between 1914 to 1918, had a devastating impact on the entire continent. Naturally, then Europe became a continent of debtors from creditors. Europe, which was rich, but now they were under heavy losses. The Weimar Republic carried the burden of war guilt. That meant that the war guilt clause blamed Germany for the war, for the First World War, and the humiliation that the Germans had to face, and they had to pay huge compensation. That is, £6 billion had to be paid for that, for the compensation. It financially crippled. Now, we had many people like socialists, Catholics and Democrats who supported the Weimar Republic. And because of their support, they were criticized by the Germans. And in fact, people made fun of them, and mockingly they were called November criminals. Why? Because they had agreed to the Treaty of Versailles. So they were called November criminals. So these many of these people who were socialists, Catholics and Democrats who supported the Weimar Republic were criticized by the common people, and in fact they were termed or considered to be November criminals. That is, that they had betrayed their country. So this mindset had a major impact on the political developments of the early 1930s. So we see that gradually these were the terms and conditions that brought about changes in the country. Now we further come on to the fact that after the First World War, what was the impact? The impact was that soldiers came to be placed above the civilians. The media glorified the trench life. That meant that what they were doing, what the soldiers were doing, was something very commendable. And they lived in trenches, but the truth was that the soldiers lived miserable lives in these trenches. Why? Because they were trapped with rats feeding on corpses. So, one is that there was more importance given to the soldiers than to the civilians. And they lived in difficult circumstances, faced poisonous gas and enemy shelling all the time. So we see that aggressive war propaganda, national honor and support grew for conservative dictatorship. Dictatorship, one-man rule. Democracy was young and fragile. It was a new idea and could not survive the instabilities of the interwar Europe. So, obviously there was bound to be instability. Now we come to political radicalism and economic crisis. The founding of the Weimar Republic coincided with the revolutionary uprising of the Spartacist League, based on the pattern of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Now, over here, Soviets of workers and sailors were established in many cities. That is, their groups. The political atmosphere in Berlin was changed with demands for, they had their demands. They pressurized that they wanted demand, and what was the demand? That is, they wanted governance according to the Soviet style, along the Soviet style. So the Weimar Republic crushed this uprising with the help of war veterans who were called Free Corps. The Communist Party was founded by the Spartacists, and this eventually brought differences between the communist and the socialist. And the communists and the socialists became enemies. They could never come together, they could not work together, and also they could not control the rise of Hitler, because in this kind of condition, that is where there was so much of political instability, obviously, eventually the rise of Hitler took place. So the economic crisis created further problems. Germany had fought the war on loans and had to repay in gold, and the gold reserves already had become depleted. Resources were scarce. So in 1923, Germany refused to pay France occupied Ruhr, which was rich in coal. So when Germany refused to pay the loan, France occupied its territory that was rich in coal. So we see that how there was so much of political instability during this period. Thank you.